Hey everyone, Metagross Freak here, and today I'm going to be making kind of a long video. I was recently in a conversation talking with someone on whether it'd be possible to cross over Steven Universe and Star Wars. Now this sounds like a really awesome idea. I mean, both series are extremely popular. They're kind of like a science fantasy that incorporate magical elements and technology and have the whole like working together as a family, you can do anything kind of themes. But it basically stops there. I mean, you take away the music to tell the tone, and they're very different series with very different interpretations of their physics. And really, it can be broken down to canons on how gems work and how the Force works. And so, if you wanted to have a crossover, you would really have to either dramatically change how gem biology works and or change how the Force works. So I'm actually going to be having title cards. That way, if you want, you can try to jump to sections. But that being started, let's get started with the first question. Okay, so the first question that I kind of addressed in the opening is gem magic the same thing as the Force? And obviously the question is no. Gem magic isn't really magic. I mean, now, gems have powers, like, for example, Lapis's water control, Peridot's magnet powers, Ruby's ability to light things on fire. That could be considered magical, but they're basically the equivalent of programs. There are a number of videos on YouTube that you can watch that basically compare a gem's gem to being a computer that houses an artificial intelligence, and that basically all the powers of a gem are the programs that the computer is designed to follow. Basically is like the equivalent of a really cool version of Siri. When if I tell instead of telling Siri to play a song, though, you're telling Siri to light something on fire or to summon a spear. Gems aren't really, gems aren't organic life. They are, non-organic, which has been made canon numerous times. I think what maybe the person I was discussing this with meant by gem magic was maybe things that are gem powered, things like the reverse pyramid, things like, again, gem weapons. Those are, or Lapis's mirror. Those are things that are powered by gems, but aren't actually magical. They're just powered by gems, and the powers that gems have are essentially the programs, the properties that they hold. Meanwhile, canonically in the Star Wars universe, the Force operates very differently. For example, all rubies have basically this set of powers. All lapises have this set of powers. All amethysts are this way. The Force, however, is non-discriminatory. In a way, the Force can be accessed by basically any species. We have Wookiees. We have humans, whatever the human equivalent in Star Wars is. We have Plo Koon species, Yoda species. Species across the universe have access to the Force. And I'll get on the topic of whether gems can be Force sensitive in a second. But basically, the Force is it's a force. And the Force can grant powers, things like Force lightning, enhanced speed, enhanced strength, the ability to resist pain, as seen basically all of those by Anakin Skywalker. The last ones, I mean. The Force can grant powers that seem magical, but unless you were somehow to explain that all gems are Force sensitive, which they're not, the Force and gem powers are basically kind of like the equivalent of birds and bats. Yes, birds can fly and bats can fly. Birds have wings, bats have pseudo wings. These are basically just flaps of skin that are on their arms. But obviously, birds and bats did not evolve from the same ancestor. It's what's called in biology divergent evolution, or I guess that'd be convergent evolution. Convergent evolution being similar properties in different areas that evolved through the same way. It's like the equivalent of there being poisonous frogs and poisonous insects. They're not, the frogs and the insects are not both poisonous because they have a common ancestor. It's because frogs developed poison, insects developed poison. Gems have their abilities, the Force grants abilities on its own. They're not one and the same. Okay, next question up is, could gems power lightsabers? First off, it'd be really cool. Like, it'd be really cool if you just have a lightsaber and then you're just like, you know what, this lightsaber's not doing it for me. You crack open the lightsaber and you have, you have a rose quartz. You toss the rose quartz out into the battlefield and it becomes another soldier. That's like a hilariously cool idea. Like, it's so over the top and ridiculous that I like it as an idea, but it wouldn't happen. Gems can't power lightsabers. This is mostly because all lightsabers have to have some kind of crystal, which, the gems, first off, not all gems even are crystals. A pearl and a bismuth are not actually crystals. They're basically just mineral compounds, or in the case of bismuth, metals. That's not the point. The point being is that gems can't power lightsabers because all lightsabers are powered using either KYBER crystals, which is the canonical name for lightsaber crystals, KYBER crystals, or through artificial crystals, which are generally created using using basically Sith alchemy. Now, Sith alchemy is kind of like magic, but it's essentially using the dark side of the Force to change states of matter of things. So Sith alchemy is basically the closest thing you have in canon to actual magic, but it isn't magic. When we're talking about magic, we're talking about like using mana to perform spells. So yeah, gems would not be able to power a lightsaber unless, of course, you had a kyber crystal that was a gem. Now, if you hypothetically had this crossover, since every type of gem and crystal and every type of geode and gem we have on Earth is a type of gem, it would make sense that if you had this crossover, a kyber crystal could potentially become a gem. Kyber crystals, if you're not familiar with them, are force-sensitive gems. Depending on their depiction, sometimes they can have color, but across most canons, they are colorless gems, and upon being reunited or being connected with a Force user, they gain a color. That's why, and depending on the nature and the link to the Force, they may turn different colors. That's why basically every Sith has a red lightsaber and every Jedi has a blue or green. It's very similar to the Green Lantern Corps, the Red Lantern Corps, if you're familiar with DC. And because that's basically how the Force works. The light side of the Force is tied with positive emotions, things like diplomacy, love, friendship, things like that. Basically the equivalent of the Green Lantern Corps. Meanwhile, the dark side of the Force is tied to negative emotions, things like anger, hatred, revenge. That's why that's just like the dark side of the Force. So I think honestly it'd be easier to have a DC crossover with Star Wars than have a Steven Universe and Star Wars crossover, just because that would make a lot more sense. Like, it would honestly make sense if Hal Jordan was a Jedi and if, the Sith were part of the Red Lantern Corps. That would work. Steven Universe, not so much. But theoretically, if you had a kyber crystal, since since they are crystals, theoretically, since kyber crystals are also force sensitive, it could be possible for a kyber crystal to be a gem, and that would be the only force sensitive gem. Because the force can travel, basically the force is created through a link to spiritualism, as well as midichlorian count. And I know everyone who hates the prequel trilogy is typing in their comments now about how I brought up midichlorians, but that is what's canon to the Star Wars universe right now. And so if you are like, midichlorians aren't canon, get over it, okay? I get that you don't like the prequels. Oh well, they're canon. Get over it. Gems don't have a bloodstream, so they can't have midichlorians. It's not really specified how kyber crystals are force sensitive, but they're somehow force sensitive, and basically the whole thing about kyber crystals is they are non-organic beings that have the ability that can channel the force. That's what makes them special. If, a sapphire or a rose quartz or a jasper were force sensitive, then they wouldn't be their gems, they would be kyber crystals. I really don't know how else I can explain this more without reiterating things I've already said. Next question. So this one should be pretty obvious. Can non-gems summon gem weapons, and can gems summon force weapons? I can see the similarities. The concept of a gem weapon and the concept of force weapons are very similar, but they're just like the concept of convergent evolution. They are not the concept, it's a scientific principle. Like the scientific principle of convergent evolution, they are similar but different. A force weapon, for those of you who are not familiar with the expanded universe, is essentially concentrating the force into a physical form, traditionally like that of a club, a sword, a staff. Basically, you're using solidified force energy to create a weapon instead of holding a physical weapon in your hands. Gem weapons, however, are made of the same light that gems are made of, except instead of forming, hands or legs, you're forming a sword or a spear or gauntlets or a whip. But if a gem is not force sensitive, they cannot create a force weapon, and if a force sensitive user does not have a gem, they cannot create a gem weapon. I don't know why that one was so hard, but apparently that was a question that was asked multiple times. Next question. So I actually really like this question. Are gems on the light side of the Force? And the answer I kind of addressed earlier, and that's kind of really a maybe. The gems are made of light. They're basically holograms with mass. They are canonically known as light with mass, essentially the equivalent of hard light. If you're familiar with the sci-fi principle of hard light, that's what gems are. It's really that simple. But just because they're physically made of light does not mean they're on the light side of the Force. I don't really know why this necessarily has to be explained, but the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force are not literally the light and the dark. Like if it's sunny outside, the dark side of the Force isn't weakened, and if it's night, the light side of the Force isn't weakened. That's not how the Force works. Like I mentioned before, with the different lantern cores, the light side and the dark side are associated. Are basically, they got their names from positive and negative emotions, respectively. Those who were able to channel more positive emotions, like love and friendship, have light side powers. Those who channel negative emotions, like hatred and anger, have dark side powers. you know, Anakin, like for example, when Anakin shifted from a Jedi to a Sith, he didn't suddenly lose his light side powers and gain his dark side powers. He gained, well, he did gain dark side powers, but he didn't. It's not like he didn't have the dark side powers before. He could use the dark side. It's just he wasn't channeling the proper emotions to access them. Um, you know, so gems could be on the light side, but they can also be on the dark side of the Force. Jasper, the gem Jasper, is really big on revenge. Really big on revenge and really big on anger. Jasper would be a dark side user if she was, or would be if she was Force sensitive, but would be considered a dark side person. Same thing with with Eyeball Ruby. Eyeball Ruby has a lot of anger issues. Meanwhile, Steven and Rose Quartz would for sure be a light side person, as would Garnet. Garnet's whole thing is literally she is a physical manifestation of love. She would be light side. Meanwhile, characters like Lapis Lazuli, Lapis isn't really evil, but because her big thing is she can't forgive herself, she's really angsty. Technically, she's really angsty. She has a lot of regret and kind of pent up aggression. Like her powers in the Star Wars canon would stem from the dark side of the Force. That's just how the Force works. Even though the gems are physical light, they are not on the light side. Okay, so here's another actually really good question. Can gems be drained of light? Yes and no. Based on what we know in canon, gems basically they create light. Their bodies are created from the light that their gem emits. Now, again, that light isn't the light side of the Force, but let's say you had a weapon, like a hypothetical weapon or device that could drain the light from beings. I don't necessarily, if you were able to drain like the physical light from things, that would prevent a gem from reforming its physical body. If let's say Pearl was standing in front of this machine and the machine sucks up all her light, she would poof back into a gem. She would not die, she would just poof back into a gem. If she tried to reform, her gem would emit light. You could try to suck up more of that light. She'd poof again. If you basically just tried to drain her physical gem, it could potentially corrupt her. And that's kind of implied in Steven Universe canon how corrupted gems work. Basically, it's been either that their light has been drained, or that just how the way their gem works has been drained kind of in such a way that they're not able to manifest properly. They kind of compare it to, rather than, instead of, it's like if you get a tear in your shirt, that's, that'd be like the equivalent of hurting a gem. But if I, tore the fabric of tore the fabric of the atoms holding my shirt together, that'd be how corruption works. Like, the atoms would be damaged even if the shirt doesn't fall apart. Corruption is weird, and we don't really know that much about it. Though I would assume if you drained a gem of light, they would poof, and if you attempted to drain them more, you could maybe corrupt them. So the last question for right now is, if Steven and Luke fused... First, why are we still using Luke? Like, Luke was the hero back in the original trilogy. Why are we still using Luke? I don't know. But anyway, if Steven and Luke fused, what would it be like? Physically, the answer is really obvious. When Steven and Connie fused, it looked like a combination of them, and they shared each other's clothes. When Steven and Amethyst fused, it looked like a combination of Steven and Amethyst, and their clothes are similar. So a combination of Steven and Luke Skywalker what I would like to refer to as Levin Universe Walker, the L from Luke and the even from Stephen. So Levin Universe Walker, or Levin, I guess if you want to be specific, would be kind of like Stevani, be a little chubby, but also kind of athletic. So very much physically like Stevani. Clothing wise would either be Luke's traditional like white robe over Stephen's clothes, or I think would be really cool would be Luke's robes, but the pinkish red color of Stephen's shirt with like a star on the back or something. That just physically that seems obvious, and like Stevani, since Luke can't summon a gem weapon, Levin Skywalker or Levin Skywalker would have Stephen's shield and would have Luke's lightsaber. That's easy. But personality, what would they be like? First off, this would have to be really hypothetical because it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen even if you had a really long crossover, because Stephen would have to have the same kind of relationship with Luke that he has with Connie and Amethyst. Remember that Connie is Stephen's best friend and basically his girlfriend. I mean, it has been heavily implied that Stephen actually loves Connie. So it makes perfect sense that they fused. And Amethyst is basically Stephen's sister. They have a really close bond, and that basically their relationship is like brother and sister. So it makes sense that they fused. If Stephen was just meeting Luke Skywalker for the very first time, the only way they would be able to fuse is if it was an absolute emergency. And the cost, the benefit of them fusing would have to outweigh them being separate. Like having Stephen and Luke Skywalker would, in my opinion, be more beneficial than just having Levin Universe Walker, because then you'd basically either have a gem or a Force or a Jedi Knight, or just a Jedi Knight with either a Jedi Knight with gem powers, I guess, or a Force sensitive gem. To me, that does the benefits don't outweigh the losses. But if it did happen, what would they be like? Stephen and Luke are both kind of naive. Stephen is pretty cheerful. Meanwhile, Luke is kind of like an angsty teen. So maybe a little bit like Smoky Quartz. It's kind of hard to tell. I honestly think it would be so unlikely to happen that it'd be hard to speculate. Because Stephen would have to be in the kind of position where he would not be able to fuse with any gem or Connie, and then he would have to then form a close enough relationship with Luke Skywalker that he would be willing to fuse with him. And that just seems really unlikely. Hopefully this will only be a one-part video. If the person I've been talking to for the last couple days messages me back with more questions, I might make a part 2 to this video. But thank you all for watching. I know some of you who are Steven Universe and Star Wars fans really might think that this is a good crossover idea, but I personally believe it isn't. It's just basically the answers to all of these questions have been no, or yes under this specific instance. Like, for example, the gems being Force sensitive. No, because they're not KYBER, because they don't have midichlorians and they're not KYBER crystals, like that kind of a thing. It's just, I think that the physics of how the Force work and the physics of how gems work are too dissimilar for it to actually work in canon. But thank you all for watching. Until next time, I've been Metagross Freak, and ask good questions. I like good questions. Thanks.